Hi, I'm Andrea Allen. I am part of the math strand of DS, and this is the instrumentation project. It is an analysis on the transfer of skills from one instrument to another. All right, about this project. So, as you may or may not know, I am a violinist. And as a musician, I've always known that I wanted to do my senior project on something about music. I originally thought that I would just compose a few pieces based on some sort of mathematical analysis, but as I thought about different projects and different ideas, this one in particular stuck with me. This idea being, if someone who knew one instrument, such as the violin, and then learned another, like, say, the flute, and then another, say, the piano, would they learn each instrument faster? So that's the question that I aim to answer with this experiment. So why the violin, flute, and piano? I originally decided on the violin to experiment with because it is something I'm already comfortable with and something that I'm able to teach someone else how to play. And I wanted to be able to compare something else with the violin, but with a different skill set. So what I chose was the flute. Now, the great thing about the flute is that one, it does take a different skill set to be able to play well, and two, it is also a C instrument. Now, both the violin and the flute are C instruments, which essentially means that you don't have to change what notes you're playing. You have to change what you're hearing when you pick up either instrument. So therefore, the students only have to learn the skills behind the instruments rather than learning new notes on the instruments. So these are my experiment instruments. So the baseline instrument, what I will be my control, will be the piano. The piano I chose because it's also a C instrument, so you don't have to learn any new notes, new sounds, but also it doesn't take any skill to create the right note, like it would with the flute or the violin. So therefore, it, again, a different set of skills and a little bit easier to acclimate to. So the next questions I had to answer was how to implement comparison, randomization, control, and replication in this experiment. So comparison is essentially comparing two or more treatments. As I previously explained, the learning of the violin or flute would be the treatment aspect, and I implemented a control aspect, which would be learning the piano. That's the baseline instrument. Next, there is randomization. This essentially is randomly assigning each subject to a treatment in order to decrease variability in the experiment, because if they chose it for themselves, they might have some bias. So if we choose it for them, if we choose it randomly for them, then there will be less bias in that experiment. Next, there's control, making sure all the conditions are the same, making sure that experimentation is the same in order to, again, decrease variability. And then we have replication, making sure we have enough subjects in order to repeat the experiment in order to accurately see if there's cause and effect in this experiment. Next, we have the design of this experiment. So essentially, this is called a randomized block design. So the blocks being the, say, 4 violins and 4 flutes, and then comparing them as we go on, and then comparing them at the end. So let me show you what this looks like. So we have our 8 volunteers. So these volunteers consisted of 2 groups, violins and flutes. So next what we had to do was, as we discussed earlier, randomly assign them to include that randomization aspect. Randomly assign them to a treatment. So this treatment being either the experimental group or the control group for each of the violin group and the flute group. So moving on, so here we have our 2 groups, our 4 violinists and our 4 flutists. So essentially with the 2 from each group that were randomly assigned to be part of the experimental group, they will essentially swap instruments. So the 2 violinists will learn flute and 2 flutists will learn the violin. Now these last 4 people from each group won't learn the opposite instrument. Instead, the experimental group will first learn their opposite instruments, and then all of them will learn the piano at the same time. So again, this top group is our experimental group, and this bottom group is our control group in order to compare them to the experimental group. So moving on, we have our experimental group and our control group. The experimental group consisting of the 2 flute and the 2 violin experimental, and the control consisting of the 2 piano and the 2 piano down here. So moving on, we will then compare their progress on the piano, and then compare them all together. So to recap, we have our comparison, randomization, and replication. For comparison, we have our 2 treatments. That would be the experimental group and the control group, as we previously discussed. Next, we have randomization. So to randomly assign all of our subjects, we used a random number generator for each of the groups of 4, and assigned 2 of them to be part of the experimental and 2 to be part of the control. Lastly, we have our replication. We had 8 subjects at the start of the experiment, though throughout the process, one of our subjects did drop, so our final evaluation consisted of 7 subjects. For control, we only had people learn C instruments in order to learn only the skills behind the instruments rather than the notes. So this was the piano, the violin, the flute. And next we had everyone practice the same amount of time. We had them practicing in groups. We had everyone evaluated through the same rubric according to their instrument. And lastly, we had everyone learn the same music. For the violin, they all learned a rendition of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. For the flute, they learned Hot Cross Buns, and for the piano, they all learned the Minuet in G major. For each instrument, we performed evaluations to obtain our quantitative data to analyze the growth on the instruments. So each instrument lists what we looked for and that's what we evaluated for, and each evaluation was out of 70 points. And here we have our results. Now see here we have our initial evaluation to our final evaluation. The most important part that we looked at was the difference in these scores, their growth in these aspects, in the aspect of the piano. So what we wanted to see was if the flute and violin group, these 3 here, had learned more, had grown more than the control group, which consists of all these pianists. So here's the math that we used in order to determine whether or not there was a significant difference between these 2 sets of scores. So we did a 2-sample t-test, and the most important part is this p-value down here. So as you see, this p-value is greater than alpha equals 0.05, and we'll explain that in the next slide real quick. So what does this p-value mean? Essentially, this means that this mean difference means the growth, their true mean growth in their evaluations among the experimental group and the control group were the same. If they were the same, then the probability that a sample of this size being as great or greater than the control group is 0.2758. So essentially, this result has a 27.58% chance of occurring, which in statistics is not considered significant. If we wanted this to be significant, this number would have to be less than 0.05 or less than 5%. And that's what we saw in the previous slide with the alpha equals 0.05. So this would not be considered statistically significant, so therefore we cannot say that the growth of the experimental group of those that learned either the violin or flute and then the piano, that their growth was not greater than the growth of those who just learned the piano. So this was not necessarily the result I was hoping for. I was hoping for something more conclusive. So if I were to do this experiment again in the future, this is how I would improve it. First, I would experiment with more subjects. I was originally hoping for 16 subjects in total, 8 people who could play the violin and 8 people who already played the flute. And overall, that would just help with the experiment in general. Next, I would hope that they would learn the instruments themselves over a longer period of time, and then have the subjects learn the instruments in a more consistent schedule. Since these subjects were students at Olathe North, it was difficult to work around their schedules and be able to make sure that they all met together at the same time. I was able to achieve this a majority of the time, but again, it was difficult to continue with that as we moved forward throughout the year. Next, I would want to have more evaluations, which kind of couples with having the subjects learn over a longer period of time and being able to chart that growth over time and see how that all works. And lastly, I would want to create more quantitative analyses. As you saw, I only had the evaluations, which were largely opinion-based. I'd want something more concrete, something less biased in order to make the results better. Even though I didn't get the results I wanted, I really enjoyed this process overall. Throughout it all, I have had the opportunity to learn how to teach violin and how to adapt to the different skill sets that other people have. In my future career, I do plan on teaching violin, so this has helped me prepare for that, and especially in how to teach beginner violinists. So throughout the experiment, my teaching style consisted of how I learned the violin, which was through the Suzuki method, a method where you learn the violin through listening to the music and imitating what you see, rather than reading music and being generally confused by learning new music, that sort of thing. So the students that I taught, I believe they responded fairly well to this teaching style, and with them having no experience on the violin, I was extremely surprised at how quickly they learned the instrument. Through this observation and my own personal experience, it proves that learning another instrument after already knowing one and after already spending so much time on one is an easier process. And overall, if I do this experiment again, I believe that it may be closer to yielding the result that I'm looking for. And overall, this is something that I would do again. If I have, for example, if I have an opportunity in college to be able to perform an experiment just like this, I would take it. It would be eye-opening to see if my hypothesis would actually be true with a larger group of subjects or more time or better resources. And overall, through being a teacher, I learned how to better communicate different concepts of the violin and how to maintain patience, adapt to different learning styles, and etc. Over this process and working with a great group of people, it was an incredible opportunity in order to delve into teaching. Overall, I love this thing. It was so fun. And that is it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about my experiment. Thank you.